I'm going to be sharing with you strange and mysterious park ranger stories that occurred in Yellowstone National Park. Because when you look at it, there's much more than meets the eye. I very recently received an email from a man who referred to himself as Harold, and apparently, after watching my Yellowstone video, he felt compelled to share his own set of stories while working in the park from 1996 to 2002, along with sharing multiple stories of his colleagues. These stories that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight are all in 1996. Now keep in mind that in 1996, wolves at this point had already been reintroduced into Yellowstone as of 1995. On a late spring evening, by about the end of May, I believe is what Harold had said, he had received a call about a woman who was attacked by a large wolf right by the Firehole River. For Harold, this was a very disturbing call, primarily because the Firehole Canyon area is a very popular tourist spot in Yellowstone National Park, and especially during the mid to late summer months when it is open to the public. After Harold and several of his colleagues had arrived on the scene with the woman nearly grasping at straws for her own life and was bleeding out, she was attended to medically almost immediately, and fortunately they were able to save her life. But she had some pretty crazy gashes along her side and her legs where it appeared as if something with 5 digits had tried to grab her, but she had escaped. Now, when she was questioned further by the park rangers, her story was that some sort of upright wolf had come out of the woodline and actually tried to grab her and chased her. Being incredibly frightened as anybody would seeing an upright wolf coming out of the tree line chasing you, she ran in fear and said this thing had almost been able to grab her, but she was able to wiggle free. But in the process, it had gashed her legs and her side. In the email that I received personally, Harold did not disclose the name of this victim, but said that psychologically she checked out and she was completely terrified to even go back in that area, let alone the national park. She just kept describing it as this big wolf. If we look at this story critically, could this simply just be a misidentification? Was she possibly attacked by a bear or maybe a lone wolf, and maybe somehow she just imagined it walking on 2 legs? The problem with that theory is that Harold even shot that same idea down, saying the claw marks were not only 5 digits, but they were like that of a hand, or like a clawed hand, with how it tried to grab her leg and her side. And also went on to further state that if you look at the paw size of a wolf compared to the size of this hand, whatever had tried to grab her was much larger, and as we know, bears don't try to actually grab hold of their victims with a paw, at least not in the way that this was. After being questioned by authorities and rangers alike, she was pretty adamant about her story not changing. She described it as not being a bear at all, but that it was very much like a wolf, and that it looked like a wolf, and that its ears were perked up on top of its head. It was unmistakably canine, is what she said, and it had a very large chest, bulging with muscles and rippling. And she said it was probably around 9 to 10 feet tall, and what she had described at the time that had attacked her truly baffled everybody who helped patch her up, because it was clearly impossible what she was describing. If something like that really did roam the wilderness of the United States, let alone North America, you're talking about an alpha predator killing machine here. Even Harold admits that something this large and dangerous, why did it let her go? If it was trying to grab her, well, it clearly had ill intent and probably wanted to kill and eat her, so why did it just let her go? And why did it mysteriously disappear? But on that same token, why was she so completely terrified, and how could you explain these horrendous gashes on her side and on her legs? Even Harold had admitted to me that it looked like something with hands, 4 fingers, and an opposable with large claws had tried to physically grab her and stop her from going. And had she not got the medical treatment that she needed, she would have bled out. He didn't really go into detail about how she was able to make the call, and if people had found her that then sought the attention of park rangers and staff personnel to get the attention that she needed. But one thing is clear from this case is that if something really is out there in the woods that is this large, that is able to do this to people, could this possibly explain other missing hikers and people in the woods? Or did this woman simply just have some sort of mass hysteria or hallucination, run herself through some thorn bushes to the point where she was all scratched up? I mean, what do you guys think? Having Harold talk about how disturbing it was seeing this really set a tone for what was to come in the park. About 3 weeks later, now in late June, right around campsite 8R5, right near the lake, a young couple who had been camping out there actually complained to the staff about feeling uncomfortable the entire night and feeling like they were being watched. And the male also complained of hearing what sounded like a pack of wild dogs going crazy out in the woods. It apparently kept the young couple up all night, but it was more than just an inconvenience, because this actually spooked them into leaving. And sure, if you look at it that way, there could be a lot of explanations for something like this, but with how scared they were, something just did not line up. And similar accounts and reports had been popping up left and right all over the park right during the same time. It was nothing ever major like bodies being found or strange creatures being seen, but just little things here and there. People talking about the feeling of being watched in certain areas of the park, or people seeing strange shadows moving amongst the trees, and even one couple who supposedly saw a glowing pair of yellow eyes watching them on a night hike. And those are just the tiny accounts and reports that had actually been complained about and talked to with staff personnel. And that's not accounting for any of the stories that had gone on unreported. And as a matter of fact, that same year in mid-July, a colleague of Harold's was walking from Pocket Lake when he had told Harold about a pretty terrifying experience that he had with a baboon-like creature, that something was following him in the woodline, and the entire time he sensed that he was in great danger. And as he looked, he could see this large, lumbering shape hiding behind the trees but slowly watching him. And as he almost made it back near the main trail, he finally caught a glimpse of this thing peering out from a large tree behind, looking at him, and claimed its face looked like some sort of misfigured baboon or something, but that it was of incredible size, probably around 10 feet tall, if not larger. He was completely terrified by this, but due to the nature of what he saw and the whole experience, he decided to keep it to himself and not talk about it to anybody else, except Harold and some other colleagues who all shared similar experiences in and around that same area. Now, Harold did not share any of those other experiences with me, but what he did share would just continue to prove the point that in 1996 and the years to come, there was definitely things going on in the park that nobody could explain. And these aren't just your typical missing 411, missing person stories. These are logical people who've worked and are working at the park at the time, who are experiencing these bizarre phenomena. Harold actually referred to this gentleman as Kyle. And as he recalls, Kyle had a pretty terrifying experience, one that he cannot explain, about a week prior to this baboon-like sighting. Harold had went on to tell me an experience that Kyle had, which was an elderly couple complaining about something trying to break into their trailer. This old, sweet elderly couple from Iowa had come with their RV and had parked, and the older gentleman explained that sometime in the morning, he heard something large going around the RV, banging on the walls, rattling, trying to get into the RV. Completely spooked, he thought it was somebody trying to break in. So he goes up to the window and peers out right at the door, and he's met with two glowing eyes looking back at him from outside the window, and teeth slowly showing, snarling at him. Completely terrified, he ends up hiding in the back with his wife in the RV and waiting for this thing to disappear. After about an hour or so, he had told Kyle that everything went quiet, and he slowly, was curious, had crept up to the RV door, opened it, and tried to peek around outside to see if whatever this thing was still in the area. But he was slapped in the face by this putrid odor of wet dog and urine, and he claims it was so overpowering he practically had to hold his nose from gagging and vomiting right there. As daylight broke, he contacted the staff, and since Kyle was closest, he went to go speak to this couple, and this is the exact story they relayed to him. Kyle had tried to rationalize with them and calm them down and explain it could have just been a bear, and was asking them if they had left any food out at any time during the night or the day before, to which they replied no, but that this couple was so terrified, they left as soon as the conversation was done with Kyle. Kyle had decided to do a bit of further inspecting, but found no trace of tracks or any other signs that this being, as they described, was in the area. However, he said that when he did arrive by the RV, this putrid smell of wet dog and urine, just like the older man had described, was lingering in the area still, but much more faint, and not as strong like he had described it. So this couple had clearly dealt with something, but what? He's not too sure. Again, due to the strange nature of this encounter and case, Kyle had never reported this to his up-aboves and only shared it amongst his friends and colleagues. Now, this next story that was shared with Harold, even he admitted that he had a hard time believing it, but the gentleman who shared it with him is a longtime ranger and park personnel, and unfortunately passed away in 2006 due to pancreatic cancer, which he had been battling for years. He was a very logical, very analytical, serious person, was not a storyteller, did not make things up. He was very to the point, and because he had this long, lush history of growing up in the outdoors, hunting with his grandparents and father, before finally becoming a park ranger and pursuing that whole career his entire life, this man had come into a gamut of situations out in the wild, from dealing with bear to mountain lion, etc. This man did not know fear, but told Harold that this was really one of the only times if ever that he was truly afraid to be outside. And his story goes that while out in the backcountry of Yellowstone, in about 1993, as Harold recalls it. And remember, this is before wolves had been reintroduced yet. That wouldn't be until 1995. At multiple points during the springtime, this older gentleman, who Harold never named, would often find large, what appeared to be canine tracks in the snow and the mud, all throughout the various parts of the backcountry. But here's the unsettling part, is that these tracks weren't just tracks, they were bipedal, which did not make any sense. I mean, not only were there not any wolves here, but for them to be of this size and bipedal, it just did not make any sense. Now, the first time he saw it, he wrote it off, but they kept appearing, and oftentimes near and around bodies of water. While he had no explanation for it, and he did find it very bizarre, he simply just assumed that it was maybe a disfiguration or a distortion from the mud and the imprints, and that there was a very logical explanation for it. And this is right when he went on to describe by far the most disturbing finding of all, and his experience that completely terrified him. As spring was really beginning to take off, and it's now hitting about May or June and things are really warming up, he came to a small clearing in the woods. He had stumbled upon a fresh kill. Now, fresh kill in Yellowstone is not anything new because there are predators like bears and wolves, which again would later be introduced in 1995, but this kill would defy all that he knew. And even Harold had a hard time accepting this as fact at first because it's just so out there. And the kill that this gentleman found was not that of a person, but that of a grizzly bear that was dead right there. And the manner of which it was killed was even more bizarre. You see, right next to this bear's body was a young, uprooted white spruce tree. And after looking and inspecting this grisly scene, no pun intended, he tells Harold that after inspecting, it appeared that something had grabbed this young white spruce, uprooted it, and used it as a weapon to beat this grizzly bear to death, and that this grizzly bear's skull was actually caved in from a sheer amount of force of being beaten over the head. On top of that, its body appeared to be mangled and beaten as if it had been ran over by several trucks. Something clearly had pulverized and beaten to a bloody pulp a full-grown grizzly bear. He could simply not believe his eyes of what he was seeing in front of him. It defied all logic and reasoning. But as he inspected further and looked around the bear's body, he noticed something else that was even more unsettling than the bear's body and the condition in which it was killed, is that he found large, as he described it, or what Harold described what he saw, were large human-like tracks, 5 toes in all, and very deep in the earth, were about 17 to 19 inch long tracks, and that these circled all around the bear and went off a little ways into the brush, where they began to fade away more and more. Now, completely perplexed by what he was seeing, and out of curiosity, he decided to follow it a little ways, where he came across almost a large, hole dug into the side of a small hill, where he went on to tell Harold about the rough estimated dimensions, which was probably about 5 feet wide and maybe about 7 feet tall, that something had actually dug a hole, not with tools, but it looked like primitively dug, down into the earth about maybe 7 or 10 feet, where he could see the opening of a larger chamber. And he said the odor that was coming out of that chamber was like that of putrid, rotten body odor and skunk, and it was really bad. And even though he didn't go into this small tunnel or opening, he said he stood right by it and could peer down into it, and the tunnel probably sloped down about 95 degrees before it dropped off into this chamber, and told Harold that he believes that whatever killed this grizzly bear was living in this den, and that same musty, stink, skunk odor was all around where that bear was. And it's as he was inspecting this, trying to wrap his mind around what even happened and how does this even make any sense, he starts to get the sensation that something is watching him, and he feels he is in imminent danger, like something is stalking him or hunting him. Thinking instinctively, he goes to turn and leave the same way he came, and he tells Harold that as he left, he was able to see, and he didn't see this the first time, that on that young white spruce that was uprooted from the ground, there was actually dried blood all along the side of it, just like if you were to take a wooden object and beat something to death with it, there would be blood on it. This just further spooked him even more, and as he was leaving, he could hear something very large barreling through the woods coming after him. And whatever this was had abruptly stopped right by the opening where the tree line is. And he said he could hear it breathing really heavily. And it reminded him of somebody who had long suffered with emphysema or some sort of respiratory disorder. He was able to escape out of there with no harm being done to him, but tells Harold that that was the most terrified he has ever been, and could not explain the scene in which he had found that day. Harold tells me that he and his colleagues had never found anything quite as disturbing as that, but that another one of his colleagues, and also close friend whom he worked with for several years, had strange experiences with what he called aliens or UFOs, seeing strange balls of light moving in the trees and sky at nighttime that he could not explain, reappearing and disappearing and moving and gliding. Apparently one evening, one of Harold's friends had been speaking to a couple from Ohio, and they were pretty spooked because apparently this large person, as they described it, a large hairy person, had been following them on the hiking trail the entire time, and that what they originally thought was a bear turned out not to be a bear. And while a lot of people do report Bigfoot-like activity, he wasn't really buying it until this evening, when he was driving on a dirt road, and out of nowhere, his entire vehicle becomes engulfed in this blinding white light where he actually had to stop and hold up his arms to shield his eyes from the blinding bright white light. And he had told Harold that out of nowhere, these small beings that were roughly about 3.5 feet tall, bulbous heads, gray skin, they looked very dead, and large black eyes had all appeared around his vehicle, speaking to him telepathically, telling him the time in which he was going to die, and that they were there to warn mankind of the coming disasters, and the only way to save themselves was to leave the planet. He said after that his memory turned blurry and he just remembers awakening at the side of the road where it had last happened, and said it felt so very real, and it was unlike any dream or any experience he's ever had. He's had no past experiences of hallucinations or using any sort of drugs, and tells Harold that the experience completely terrified him, so much so that he actually had to go and get a psych eval. And it was during this exact same experience that 4 hours of time had somehow gone by, and he said to him he could have sworn it had only been about 3 or 4 minutes. And there also appeared to be 2 small horizontal puncture wounds right on the back of his neck. Upon further inspection by medical professionals, there wasn't anything under his skin, there wasn't any alien chips or anything probed into his flesh, no metal plating or any sort of crazy inscriptions, just 2 small horizontal puncture wounds that could very easily be explained. But his claim was that he had no idea how they got there, and that they were right at the base of his skull. And as spring and summer turned into early fall, a gentleman had shared his story at the time with Harold about when him and his girlfriend were camping within Yellowstone's borders. They were awoken one night by a strange guttural noise outside their tent. Not afraid and unsure what this was, this guy climbs out of his tent with his flashlight, scans the surrounding area but doesn't see anything. But when he goes to do a second scan and he sweeps his flashlight, his lights catch something. These bright yellow eyes watching him from about 30 feet away. And he tells Harold that all he saw were these glowing yellowish orange eyes, and whatever was on was so black that the light did not even illuminate it. It was like illuminating a shadow. And he tells Harold that he instantly seized with fear, almost dropping his flashlight. The guttural growling sounded somewhat similar to what he described as like a lion. He bolts back in his tent, gripping the only weapon he has, which was a pocket knife, and the night was still around him. There's no crickets, there was nothing. He just felt terror. He tells Harold that fortunately his girlfriend never woke up, or if she did, she only stirred and fell back to sleep, but he laid awake there the entire night, and in the morning still felt a very ominous presence, as he described. He tells Harold he has been camping since he was a kid and has never had any sort of experiences like that ever before. These are just a handful of strange and unexplained experiences out in Yellowstone National Park by people just like me and you. And these were just a handful of the stories that occurred in 1996. In the next episode to come following this series, we will cover the 1997 stories and the years to come after that. Could this really be work of the supernatural, the paranormal, and cryptids, or are these just simply all fabrications and misidentifications of something natural? I'll let you be the judge on these. As always, guys, go ahead and leave a comment down below, let me know what you think, and slap that like button. And if you're new to the channel, I hope you enjoyed it. If you do enjoy it, be sure to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new piece of content. And as always, guys, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.